In a classroom where laughter once masked cruelty and whispers of power echoed louder than any lesson, a quiet revolution was about to unfold. Marcus Thompson, a teacher whose calm was forged in the fires of every slight and every silence he'd weathered, walked into room 301 with nothing but a battered briefcase and an unshakable belief in the truth. What he found were not just students, but a battleground of privilege and prejudice, a chorus of carefully curated masks that cracked only when confronted with the power of a single voice that refused to be silenced. As secrets were dragged into the light and whispered cruelties exposed, the question became not whether they could break him, but whether they were ready to face the truths he would not let them deny. This is not just a story of confrontation. It is a testament to the quiet power of dignity, to the unyielding resolve that turns even the softest voice into a force that cannot be ignored. Marcus Thompson's first morning at Lincoln High School was not what he had envisioned during those long nights spent preparing lesson plans and rehearsing the opening lines of classic texts that had shaped his life. As he stepped into room 301, the air felt electric, thick with the unspoken challenge of students who had already decided they would test him, measure him, and find him lacking. He could see it in the way Madison Pierce twirled a strand of hair around her finger, a calculated show of indifference that belied the sharpened edge of her smile, and in the bored half-glance Jessica Kumar gave him before returning to the phone she held so carelessly in her hand. Marcus paused at the doorway, taking in the rows of desks arranged like silent sentinels, the scuffed linoleum floors, the dust motes dancing in the harsh morning light. He inhaled deeply, steadying himself with the warm, familiar scent of old books and chalk dust, a reminder of the countless teachers who had come before him and who had, in their own quiet ways, carved out spaces of possibility and hope in classrooms like this one. He walked to the front of the room, his steps even, measured, the gentle rhythm of his loafers on the tile, a small act of defiance against the hushed laughter that rose and fell like a wave behind him. He felt the weight of every gaze, the challenge in every smirk and every carefully concealed glance. But he would not be bowed. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm, almost soft, yet carrying an undercurrent of unwavering resolve. "My name is Mr. Marcus Thompson, and I will be your literature teacher." His words hung in the air, met with a silence that was anything but empty. In that silence, he could hear the tension humming like a taut wire, could feel the weight of Madison's whispered, "Look who they sent to teach us," as if it were a stone in his chest. Yet, he did not let it sink him. Instead, he turned to the whiteboard, uncapped the marker with deliberate care, and wrote his name in clear, unhurried script, each letter an assertion of presence, of belonging. As he wrote, he thought of his mother's steady voice telling him, "You do not need to raise your voice to command a room. Your presence is enough." And so, when he turned back to face them, he let that presence speak for itself, let it fill the space between them like a quiet, defiant anthem. For a moment, the room was utterly still. Madison's smirk faltered, just slightly, and Jessica's fingers paused mid-scroll. Marcus seized that flicker of uncertainty, not with triumph, but with the quiet understanding that here, in this moment, he had the power to choose how this story would unfold. "This year," he continued, his tone steady, "we will explore the power of words, the way they shape the world, the way they reveal the truths we so often try to hide." He let his gaze move from face to face, lingering for a heartbeat on each student, not with judgment, but with the kind of measured curiosity that had always been his greatest strength. "I know some of you may doubt what I can offer. That's all right," he said, his lips curling into the faintest hint of a smile. "Doubt can be the beginning of understanding, if you let it." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle in the air, and in that pause, he could almost feel the room itself lean forward, the first tentative crack in the wall of indifference that had greeted him. "So," he said finally, setting the marker down with a soft click, "let's begin." And with that, he opened the well-worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird that he had carried with him for years, the book that had taught him that courage was not the absence of fear, but the resolve to face it, and began to read. The next morning, as Marcus stepped into room 301, the atmosphere felt even more charged, like the electric hum in the air before a summer storm. He could feel it in the restless shifting of feet beneath desks, in the quick conspiratorial glances that flickered between the girls who had already decided he did not belong here. Madison sat at her usual place near the window, her hair catching the early light like a halo of gold, her eyes hard and unblinking as she watched him approach the lectern. Jessica Kumar was perched 2 rows behind, her expression carefully neutral, but Marcus could see the gleam of calculation in her eyes, a mind already working to craft the next snare. He greeted them with the same calm that had carried him through countless first days and countless tests of character. "Good morning," he said evenly, and though he spoke softly, his voice carried, filling every corner of the room. He paused a moment, letting the greeting hang in the air like a question, and then turned to the board to write the day's topic: narrative power and perspective. As he wrote, he heard the faint click of a phone camera shutter, a sound almost too quiet to notice, but in that stillness it echoed like a dare. He didn't turn to see who it was. He didn't need to. He knew it was Madison, documenting this moment to share later in the privacy of her curated digital kingdom, where snide comments and half-truths could be repackaged as wit. But Marcus had long since learned that the power of a teacher did not lie in controlling every moment. It lay in refusing to let such moments control him. So he turned back to the class, marker in hand, and began. "We are going to explore how stories are told," he said, his tone even, his eyes scanning each face, "and how the way a story is told can reveal more about the storyteller than the story itself." There was a flicker of something in Madison's eyes, a small, involuntary tightening of her mouth, as if she recognized the challenge but refused to let it show. Jessica crossed her legs slowly, the soft rustle of fabric loud in the otherwise quiet room. Marcus watched them both, not with anger, but with a kind of measured curiosity. They were used to wielding power carelessly, used to having it affirmed by the world around them. What they did not yet understand was that he had spent his whole life navigating rooms like this, rooms where the balance of power was always shifting, always fragile. He began to speak of the book they were reading, weaving in stories of his own experiences, of the voices he had carried with him since childhood, voices of writers and thinkers who had taught him that the power of a story lay not just in its telling, but in its refusal to be silenced. As he spoke, he could see the restless energy in the room begin to shift, like a current pulling in a new direction. Some students leaned forward, drawn in by the quiet authority of his voice. Others looked away, their discomfort plain. And Madison, always Madison, sat back in her chair, her phone now resting idle on her desk, her lips pursed in a line of studied disinterest. But Marcus knew she was listening. He could see it in the way her eyes flickered just slightly when he quoted Baldwin. "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." He let the words hang there, heavy and unanswerable, before turning back to the board to write the day's discussion questions. "What does it mean," he asked, "to truly see another person's perspective? To recognize the limits of your own understanding?" For a moment, there was silence. And then from the back of the room, a soft voice. Elena Rodriguez, a girl who had barely spoken on the first day. "It means," she said hesitantly, "that sometimes you have to let go of what you think you know, even if it's uncomfortable." Marcus turned to her and smiled, a small, genuine smile that seemed to light the space between them. "Exactly," he said. "It's uncomfortable, but it's the only way we learn." And with that, the lesson shifted. The air in the room seemed to grow clearer, the edges of tension softening as more students found the courage to speak. Even Jessica, though she masked it as a question meant to trip him up, was listening more closely than she wanted to admit. Madison, for her part, remained silent, her eyes narrowed in thought. But Marcus was not naive. He knew that one good lesson was not enough to undo years of entitlement and carefully constructed walls. As the bell rang and the students gathered their things, he caught the flash of Madison's phone again, the soft click of another photo, another moment she would try to twist. He said nothing. He simply gathered his materials, his expression calm, and walked to the door, pausing only to glance back at the room where so much had been laid bare in so little time. As he stepped out into the bright hallway, he felt the familiar mixture of exhaustion and hope settle in his chest. He knew the real test was still to come, that the small cracks he had seen today were only the beginning of a longer, harder battle. But he also knew something else, that every story, every single story, had the power to reveal what lay hidden beneath the surface. If only you had the patience to look, The next morning, Marcus rose before dawn, the weight of what awaited him in room 301 pressing on his shoulders like the humid summer air that clung to the city skyline outside his window. He dressed with care, choosing a crisp white shirt and the deep blue tie that always seemed to bring him luck, a small shield against the battle he knew was coming. As he tied the knot, he caught his reflection in the narrow mirror above the dresser, the lines of resolve in his brow, a testament to years of learning how to hold his ground without ever raising his voice. He arrived early, unlocking the classroom door and stepping into the hush of the empty room. The air was still, as if the walls themselves were waiting, and he took a moment to let the quiet settle around him. He set his briefcase on the desk and moved to the windows, drawing them open to let in the cool morning breeze. Outside, the courtyard was bathed in gold, the gentle rustling of leaves, a soothing contrast to the echoes of laughter and taunts he knew would fill this space soon enough. He closed his eyes and took a slow, deliberate breath, grounding himself in the memory of his grandmother's words. "The world will try to tell you who you are. Your task is to know yourself so completely that their words become nothing but noise." When the bell finally rang, he was ready. The girls filed in, each a portrait of practiced indifference and carefully curated style. Madison with her sleek hair and eyes that glimmered with calculation. Jessica with her impeccable posture and an air of detached curiosity. And behind them, the others, some watchful, some already reaching for their phones, as if preparing for the performance they expected him to give. He greeted them with the same measured calm. "Good morning," he said. And though his voice was soft, it carried a quiet authority that made even the most confident pause. He moved to the board and wrote, in firm, deliberate strokes, narrative power and perspective. The marker squeaked faintly, each letter a small act of defiance against the flickers of skepticism he felt gathering behind him. Madison leaned back in her chair, her fingers drumming an idle rhythm on the edge of her desk. "Perspective?" she echoed, her tone laced with mock curiosity. "Whose perspective, Mr. Thompson? Yours?" A murmur of amusement rippled through the room, but Marcus only turned to face her, his expression serene. "Ours," he said simply, letting the words settle in the space between them. "We all carry stories within us, stories that shape how we see the world and how the world sees us. Today we're going to learn how to listen to those stories, even the ones we might not want to hear." For a moment, Madison looked away, her mouth tightening as if to hold back another cutting remark. Jessica shifted in her seat, a flicker of something, doubt perhaps, crossing her features. Marcus took in these small movements, reading them like lines of poetry. The way Madison's jaw clenched just a fraction too tight, the way Jessica's fingers paused on the screen of her phone, betraying the smallest crack in her carefully constructed armor. He began the lesson slowly, deliberately weaving together passages from To Kill a Mockingbird with stories from his own life. Anecdotes of growing up in a neighborhood where every day was a negotiation between hope and survival, of how literature had become both a refuge and a weapon in the face of prejudice. As he spoke, he watched the way their faces shifted, some open with curiosity, others shuddered and wary. "Perspective," he said, pausing at the board, "is about more than just what we see. It's about what we refuse to see, and why." He let that linger, a quiet challenge that even the most jaded could not completely ignore. Madison crossed her arms, her gaze sharp. "And if we refuse to see something, maybe it's because it doesn't deserve to be seen," she said, her voice edged with defiance. Marcus turned to her fully, his posture relaxed, but his eyes unwavering. "Or maybe," he said gently, "it's because it challenges us in ways we're not ready to face." A hush fell over the room then, a stillness that felt almost sacred. He could see the question flickering in Madison's eyes, though she quickly masked it with a shrug, turning her attention back to the window. Jessica, however, leaned forward slightly, her phone forgotten for a moment as she watched him with a mixture of suspicion and reluctant intrigue. He did not press further. Instead, he shifted the lesson to a broader discussion, inviting other voices into the conversation. Elena Rodriguez spoke hesitantly about the discomfort of seeing herself in the characters they were reading, how it forced her to confront things she had always tried to bury. David Kim shared a brief, halting thought about feeling invisible in a world that only seemed to notice him when it was convenient. Marcus listened to them all, his nods of encouragement small but powerful, like the steady beat of a drum that reminded them he was still there, still listening. And in that listening, he offered them something they had not expected, the chance to be seen without judgment. When the bell finally rang, he watched them file out, some still avoiding his gaze, others lingering just a moment longer than they might have the day before. Madison was the last to leave, her phone clutched tight in her hand, her expression unreadable. As she passed his desk, she paused, just for a heartbeat, and Marcus saw it. Just a flicker, gone as quickly as it came, the glimmer of uncertainty beneath the defiance. He did not call her on it. He did not need to, because he knew the real battle was never fought in loud confrontations or public humiliations. It was fought in these small, quiet moments of recognition, the places where walls began to crack and the possibility of change slipped in like sunlight through a half-open door. He gathered his materials, closing his notebook with a soft thump that echoed in the now empty room. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, filling the classroom with a soft, golden glow. Marcus stood there for a moment, letting the warmth wash over him, feeling the quiet satisfaction of a man who knew that even the smallest shift in perspective could be the beginning of something vast and transformative. Then he picked up his briefcase and stepped into the hallway, ready to face whatever came next. By the end of the week, Marcus had begun to sense the shift, small, almost imperceptible at first, like a change in the wind that carries the scent of rain long before the clouds gather. The girls had grown quieter in their open mockery, their laughter now half-hearted, laced with something that tasted of uncertainty. But Marcus knew better than to mistake that for surrender. He had seen too many battles fought in the silence that follows a failed blow, in the careful recalibration of strategy by those who felt their power slipping. Madison, in particular, seemed to have retreated into a watchful stillness. She no longer smirked quite as openly, no longer interrupted with the easy confidence of someone who believed the outcome was already assured. Instead, she studied him the way a cat studies a bird, unblinking, calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Jessica, too, had grown more subtle in her provocations. Where once she might have tried to trip him up with a sharp question about race or privilege, she now asked them with an almost innocent air, her voice sweet and her eyes wide. But Marcus could feel the sharpness in her tone, the careful precision of her words, as she tried to catch him in some contradiction, some slip that would confirm the narrative she was so desperate to maintain, that he didn't belong here, that he had never belonged. And through it all, Marcus maintained his calm, refusing to be drawn into their game. He spoke with quiet authority, weaving his lessons through stories of resilience and hope, of how the greatest writers had always known that the truest power lay not in the hands of those who shouted loudest, but in those who dared to speak with unwavering conviction. But even as he taught, he was not blind to the undercurrents swirling beneath the surface. During breaks, he noticed the quick glances and hushed conversations, the way Madison and Jessica would lean in close over their phones, fingers flying in quick, urgent taps. There was something brewing there, something that felt like a gathering storm, and Marcus knew that it was only a matter of time before it broke. One afternoon, as he walked to the teacher's lounge, he passed by an open door and heard his name. Soft, quick, the way secrets are shared when no one is meant to hear. He paused, his hand on the cool metal of the doorframe, listening to the low, conspiratorial tones. "He's not like the others," Jessica was saying, her voice hushed but intense. "It's like he sees everything, like he knows exactly what we're doing." Madison laughed, a brittle sound. "He doesn't know anything," she said. "He just thinks he does. He's too careful. Always so calm, like that's going to save him." There was a pause, a silence so complete Marcus could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights. Then Madison's voice again, low and dangerous. "He's going to slip up eventually. They always do." Marcus let the words wash over him, a cold tide that left him breathless for just a moment. Then he stepped back, his movement smooth and deliberate, as if he had only been passing by, as if the words he had heard were nothing more than another chapter in a story he already knew by heart. He did not confront them, he did not need to, because in that moment he understood something vital. Their certainty was built not on strength, but on fear. Fear that he might see past their masks. Fear that he might reveal the truths they had spent so long hiding from themselves. And so he walked on, his steps measured, his face calm. But inside, he felt the first stirrings of something powerful and inexorable, a quiet, steady resolve that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the simple, undeniable force of truth. By the end of the week, The subtle dance of power in room 301 had grown more intricate, each movement of Madison's narrowed gaze and Jessica's practiced smile like threads in a tapestry of unspoken tension. Marcus felt it in the small things, the way conversation stopped when he entered the room, the carefully timed glances Madison exchanged with her friends, the faint rustle of paper as Jessica pretended to take notes but was really sketching the next trap. Yet even in this quiet hostility, Marcus sensed a new texture to their defiance, doubt. It hovered at the edges of their carefully cultivated poise, the way a shadow clings to the corner of a well-lit room. They still laughed in hushed tones, still exchanged whispered barbs when they thought he wasn't listening, but he could feel the questions behind their eyes, questions they dared not voice aloud. On Thursday morning, he arrived early, the classroom still shrouded in the soft half-light of dawn. He stood for a moment at the windows, watching the sun rise over the distant line of trees, painting the world in gold and crimson. In that moment of quiet, he allowed himself a brief pause, a single breath of hope that maybe, just maybe, change was possible here. He arranged the chairs in a circle that day, shifting the usual order of rows and hierarchy into something that felt more intimate, more equal. When the girls arrived, there was a ripple of surprise, a flicker of uncertainty that Marcus recognized as an opening. "Today," he said, his voice calm but firm, "we're going to talk about power." Madison's eyebrow arched, her lips twitching in a smirk she didn't bother to hide. "Power?" she repeated, her voice honey-sweet but sharp as glass. "Whose power, Mr. Thompson?" Marcus let the question hang in the air, his eyes meeting hers steadily. "All of ours," he said, "because power isn't just about who speaks the loudest or who sits at the front of the room. It's about who listens, who sees." A quiet settled over them then, deeper than before. Jessica shifted in her seat, her expression unreadable, while Elena Rodriguez sat straighter, her eyes bright with something Marcus recognized, the spark of a mind awakening to possibility. As the discussion unfolded, Marcus guided them carefully, weaving together threads of literature and lived experience, challenging them to see not just the stories on the page, but the stories they carried within themselves. He spoke of the ways power could be wielded to harm or to heal, of how every word spoken, every silence held, was a choice that revealed more than it concealed. Madison pushed back, of course. She always did. "Isn't it possible," she said, her voice measured, "that some people just aren't meant to have power? That some voices aren't worth hearing?" Her words cut through the quiet like a blade, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. Marcus looked at her then, not with anger, but with a kind of quiet sadness. "No voice," he said softly, "is ever truly unworthy, but we can choose whether we listen with respect or with dismissal. That choice says everything about who we are." The words landed between them like a stone in a still pond, the ripples moving outward, touching each student in ways they might not have fully understood. Jessica, for the first time, didn't have a retort. She looked down at her notes, her fingers tightening on her pen. Madison's lips parted as if to argue, but no words came. And in that silence, Marcus felt the shift, the smallest crack in their armor, a fracture through which the light might yet pour in. But he knew better than to celebrate too soon. He had learned long ago that the most dangerous moments came not in the open confrontations, but in the quiet that followed, when those who felt threatened retreated to the shadows to regroup, to plan their next move. Later that day, during lunch, he found himself in the teacher's lounge, the clatter of trays and low murmur of conversation, a soft backdrop to his thoughts. He was pouring himself a cup of coffee when he felt a presence beside him. Dr. David Lee, the history teacher with kind eyes and a quiet strength that reminded Marcus of his own father. "They're watching you closely," David said softly, not as a warning, but as a statement of fact. "But you're watching them too. I see it." Marcus nodded, his fingers tightening around the warm ceramic of his mug. "They're smart," he said quietly. "They know how to play the game." David gave a small smile, a glint of something like pride in his eyes. "So do you," he said. Then, after a pause, he added, "You're not alone in this, Marcus. Remember that." Those words stayed with Marcus for the rest of the day. A quiet echo in his mind as he returned to room 301 and found Madison and Jessica already there, heads bent together over a phone screen that went dark the moment he stepped through the door. He didn't need to see what they were planning. He already knew. But as he stood there, meeting Madison's defiant stare with his own steady gaze, he felt no fear. only a calm, unshakable resolve, because he had learned, over years of navigating rooms just like this one, that true power wasn't about silencing the laughter or stopping the whispers. It was about refusing to be defined by them. And so, as he picked up the book he had chosen for the day, a worn copy of James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time, he let the weight of their stares wash over him, grounding himself in the simple, powerful truth that no matter how hard they tried to twist the narrative, he would always have the final word. The following Monday dawned with a gray, restless sky, the air thick with the promise of rain. As Marcus made his way down the familiar halls of Lincoln High, he could feel that same heavy stillness settling over room 301, a kind of quiet that wasn't truly quiet at all, but a silence that trembled with anticipation. He paused just outside the door, his hand resting on the cool metal handle. Inside, he could already hear the low hum of conversation, Madison's soft, biting laughter, the rustle of papers being shuffled with a deliberate carelessness, the faint, tinny buzz of music leaking from someone's earbuds. It was a scene he had grown used to, yet today it felt different, sharper, more focused, as if the undercurrent of tension had finally found its edge. When he stepped inside, the room fell still for a single fleeting heartbeat. Madison looked up from her phone, her smile bright and brittle, and Marcus saw it for what it was, a challenge carefully wrapped in sugar. Jessica, perched a few seats away, met his gaze with that same unreadable expression she had worn all week, eyes too wide, too bright, as if she had already decided how this day would end. He greeted them as always, his voice calm, steady, but inside, he felt the electric buzz of intuition, an instinct honed by years of moving through spaces that were never meant to welcome him. Today, he knew something had shifted. He began the lesson without preamble, opening a battered copy of Baldwin's The Fire Next Time, and reading aloud, his voice low and measured. You know, and I know, that the country is celebrating 100 years of freedom, 100 years too soon. The words hung in the air, heavy as thunderclouds, and for a moment, even Madison's smirk seemed to falter. But then she leaned back in her chair, crossing one leg over the other with calculated grace. "That's a pretty speech, Mr. Thompson," she said lightly, her tone almost playful. "But isn't it a little dramatic for a high school class?" A ripple of laughter moved through the room, soft but pointed. Marcus closed the book gently, his eyes never leaving hers. "Dramatic," he said quietly, "is often just another word for truth that makes us uncomfortable." The laughter stuttered to a halt, and in that pause, he saw the flicker of uncertainty he had learned to watch for. The moment when someone realizes that the game they are playing is no longer as safe as they believed. But Madison only tilted her head, her eyes bright with the thrill of the contest. "Or," she said sweetly, "it's just another excuse to make everything about you." A hush fell then, deeper and sharper than before. Jessica shifted in her seat, her mouth tightening as she shot Madison a glance that was gone as quickly as it came. Marcus felt it. A crack in their alliance, a tiny fracture that told him more than any words ever could. He let the silence stretch, refusing to fill it with anything but his own calm, steady breath. Then he set the book down and looked around the room, his gaze sweeping over each student, not to challenge them, but to see them, truly see them. "This isn't about me," he said finally, his voice soft but certain. "It's about all of us, about the stories we inherit and the ones we choose to tell, about what it costs to pretend that those stories don't shape us, whether we want them to or not." For a moment, no one spoke. Even Madison's carefully composed face seemed to falter, her mouth parting as if to speak, only to close again. Then, from the back of the room, Elena Rodriguez raised her hand, hesitant, her fingers trembling just slightly. "It's about perspective," she said, her voice soft but growing stronger with each word. How sometimes the hardest thing to see is the thing that's always been there." Marcus felt a flicker of warmth in his chest, a quiet pulse of hope. "Exactly," he said, his eyes meeting hers with a small, genuine smile. "It's about choosing to see, even when it's hard." He saw it then, the way Jessica's shoulders tightened, the way Madison's nails tapped out a restless rhythm on the edge of her desk, the way the room itself seemed to lean forward, caught between the comfort of the familiar and the unsettling truth of something more. But he also saw something else, the way David Kim's eyes lit up with understanding, the way Elena sat a little taller in her chair. Small signs, but to Marcus, they were everything. a testament to the quiet power of refusing to yield. As the bell rang and the students began to gather their things, Madison lingered by the door, her phone in hand, her lips curved in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Nice speech, Mr. Thompson," she said softly, "but you should be careful. People might start to think you're taking this all a little too seriously." Marcus met her gaze without flinching, his expression calm, his voice even. "I take every student in this room seriously, Madison," he said quietly, "even the ones who think they are above it." She held his gaze for a moment longer, and in that space, Marcus saw the truth flicker behind her eyes. A brief, unguarded flash of something that wasn't arrogance or even anger, but fear. Then she turned and was gone, the click of her heels in the hallway a sharp counterpoint to the soft hush that lingered in her wake. Marcus watched her go, feeling the quiet tension in his chest ease just slightly. Because he knew storms only gather in the face of something that refuses to be moved. And he was done moving for anyone who thought they could define him. Marcus arrived the next day with a new calm in his stride, the kind that came from knowing that the tide had begun to shift, even if no one else could yet see it. The air in room 301 was taut with expectation, the kind of charged silence that felt like the brief hush before a storm. Madison sat at her desk, her phone out as usual, but her fingers fidgeted around the edges of the screen, betraying a restlessness she was careful to hide behind her carefully composed expression. Jessica's eyes flickered from Marcus to Madison and back again, as if she were measuring the distance between loyalty and doubt. The rest of the class seemed to hold its breath, sensing that something had changed, even if they didn't yet understand how. Marcus greeted them as he always did, his voice steady and warm, and then he began to speak, not of literature or history or the well-worn pages of old books, but of the simple, unshakable truths that had guided him all his life. He spoke of the weight of silence, of the ways it could both protect and destroy, of how it was often in the quietest moments that the deepest battles were fought and won. As he spoke, he moved among the desks with a calm certainty that seemed to draw the air itself around him, his eyes meeting each student's gaze with a quiet challenge that asked them not just to listen, but to see. Madison shifted in her seat, her mouth tightening as she tried to hold on to the smile that no longer quite fit her face. Jessica fidgeted with her pen, her usual calm replaced by a nervous energy that she tried and failed to mask. Even the girls who had once joined in Madison's laughter sat straighter, their eyes wary and curious all at once. Marcus let the silence settle when he finished speaking, refusing to fill it with the easy comfort of another lecture or the safe distance of a question. Instead, he let it hang there, a mirror held up to each of them, asking them to confront the truths they had spent so long ignoring. And in that silence, something shifted. Madison's fingers stilled on her phone, her jaw clenched tight as she looked down at her desk. And for the first time, Marcus saw the smallest crack in the wall she had built around herself. Jessica's hand trembled just slightly, her pen tapping out an anxious rhythm that betrayed more than any words could. The room seemed to hold its breath with them, the weight of that unspoken understanding pressing in from every corner. And Marcus, standing at the center of it all, felt a quiet satisfaction settle in his chest, a calm, resolute certainty that whatever came next, he would be ready. Because he knew that true change did not come in loud declarations or public victories, but in the small, silent moments when the truth could no longer be denied. Marcus spent the next few days moving through the halls of Lincoln High like a man walking the edge of a blade, aware of every whisper, every glance, every carefully coded message that passed between Madison and Jessica in the quiet spaces between classes. He could feel the tension thickening around him, the subtle shifts in power that spoke of alliances formed and plots whispered in the dark. But he was no longer just a bystander in this silent war. Each day he collected fragments of conversations, scraps of digital trails left carelessly on social media, screenshots of private chats that reeked of arrogance and entitlement, posts dripping with sarcasm and veiled cruelty. And each night, he documented them with the precision of a scholar, knowing that when the moment came, he would have everything he needed to show the world exactly who these girls truly were. In the midst of this quiet battle, he found an unlikely ally. Dr. David Lee, the history teacher who had watched the unfolding drama with the wary eyes of someone who had lived it all before, approached Marcus in the teacher's lounge one afternoon, a folder clutched in his hands. "I've been collecting what I can," David said softly, his voice low but steady. screenshots, posts, even recordings from the hallway. I know what it feels like to be the only one in the room who sees the truth. Marcus took the folder without a word, feeling the weight of every page, every captured moment that told a story no one could deny. He met David's gaze with a quiet nod, an unspoken understanding passing between them. They were no longer just teachers in a school that refused to see them. They were witnesses, archivists of a truth that demanded to be heard. Meanwhile, Madison and Jessica continued their charade in class, their laughter more brittle now, their jokes carrying a sharpness that cut deeper than before. Madison in particular seemed to grow more desperate in her attempts to assert control, her voice louder, her words laced with a venom that felt almost panicked. She challenged every statement Marcus made, twisting his words into traps that she hoped would catch him off guard. But Marcus refused to rise to the bait. Instead, he met each provocation with a calm that only deepened the cracks in her carefully maintained facade. He answered her questions with the steady patience of a man who had already seen the end of the story and knew how it would play out. One afternoon, as he wrapped up a discussion on narrative power, Madison's hand shot up, her eyes bright with the glint of a challenge she was sure would finally tip the balance in her favor. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice sickly sweet, "don't you think it's a little self-serving to turn every lesson into a commentary on race?" The room went still, every student turning to watch the clash they had all been waiting for. Marcus paused, his eyes meeting hers with a calm that was almost disconcerting. "I think," he said quietly, "that every story we tell is a reflection of who we are and who we choose to be. If you're uncomfortable with that, perhaps it's because you're not ready to see yourself in the story." The silence that followed was heavy, pressing down on the room like a storm cloud ready to break. Madison held his gaze for a moment longer, her lips pressed into a thin line. Then she looked away, the fight in her eyes faltering just for a moment. Marcus saw it, the crack in her armor, the brief, unguarded flash of doubt. And he knew. The moment of reckoning was close. Marcus could feel the weight of every whispered word and every sidelong glance as he walked into room 301 the next morning, the air almost humming with the promise of what was about to unfold. And as he set down his books on the worn wooden desk, he noticed that Madison and Jessica were already there, their heads bent together over Madison's phone in a hush of conspiratorial whispers that stopped the moment he stepped inside, replaced by that brittle, bright smile that Madison wore like a mask, and the cold calculation in Jessica's eyes that betrayed the storm brewing beneath her calm facade. And he greeted them with that same unwavering calm that had begun to unsettle them more than any argument ever could, his voice low and measured as he announced today's lesson, how stories can reveal truths not only about the world, but about those who tell them. And as he spoke, he could see the way Madison's fingers tightened around her phone, the way Jessica's pen hovered above her notebook without ever touching the page, and he knew that they were no longer listening to him so much as waiting for him to slip, to give them the mistake they needed to twist the narrative back in their favor. But Marcus had spent his whole life learning how to navigate rooms like this, where every word was a potential weapon, every silence a test, and he refused to give them that satisfaction. Instead, he let his words flow with a deliberate, quiet authority that filled the room with a sense of something solid and unshakable, weaving together passages of literature and glimpses of the world beyond these four walls, challenging his students not just to listen, but to truly see. And in that quiet, steady rhythm, he saw the first hints of something new in the eyes of those who had once been content to watch from the sidelines. The smallest flickers of doubt in Madison's eyes as she shifted in her seat, the quick, uncertain glance that Jessica shot at her when she thought no one was looking. And even as he spoke, Marcus was already piecing together the final threads of the truth he would soon lay bare, the folder doctor. Lee had given him tucked safely in his briefcase like a promise, and he knew the moment was close now, close enough that he could feel it in the careful hush of the room in the way the laughter had grown quieter and the smiles more strained. And as the bell rang and the girls gathered their things, he met Madison's gaze one last time, holding it with a calm that said everything she didn't want to hear. And as she turned away, Marcus felt the quiet certainty settle deep in his chest, that the reckoning was not only coming, it had already begun. The following day dawned with a brittle light, the kind that cut through the morning haze like a blade, and as Marcus approached room 301, he felt the quiet electricity of the moment crackle in the air, the tension coiling tighter with every step he took. And when he pushed open the door, he saw Madison already in her seat, her phone set neatly on the desk in front of her like a talisman she clung to more for comfort than for power now, and Jessica beside her, her fingers drumming out a restless tattoo against the wooden edge of her desk that echoed the unspoken question in her eyes. And Marcus walked to the front of the room with the steady, measured grace of a man who knew that the balance of power had shifted, even if those who had once held it refused to see it slipping through their fingers. And he began the day's lesson with a quiet authority that filled every corner of the room, his voice weaving a tapestry of words that held the class in a thrall of uneasy silence. Because in that silence, he could feel the small, careful shift in the air, the way the other students leaned forward just a fraction more than they had before, the way Madison's shoulders tightened as if she could feel the ground beneath her feet beginning to crack. And Jessica's lips parted in the beginning of a question she seemed suddenly unsure how to ask. And Marcus let the silence linger like a challenge, his calm gaze sweeping the room and resting for a moment on Madison, holding her eyes in a way that forced her to look away first, a tiny crack in the armor she had worn so easily until now. And as he spoke, he could see the fight in her faltering, the carefully rehearsed confidence giving way to something more fragile and uncertain. And even as she tried to hide it behind a quick smile and a dismissive toss of her hair, Marcus saw the truth flicker there in her eyes. The first glimmer of fear that came when the lies you built your world on began to crumble. And in that moment he felt not triumph, but a quiet, resolute purpose, because he knew that this was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when the weight of truth was heavier than the weight of privilege, and he knew he would not waste it. Marcus entered the classroom the next morning with the quiet determination of a man who had spent too long letting others define the terms of the conversation, and who was finally ready to speak his own truth without apology. He saw Madison and Jessica sitting side by side, their expressions carefully blank but their posture rigid, as if bracing themselves for something they could no longer control. The rest of the class shifted in their seats, their usual low chatter replaced by a heavy hush that seemed to press against the walls of room 301, and Marcus let that silence stretch just a moment longer before he spoke, his voice calm and steady as he announced that today's lesson would be about consequences, the way they shape us, the way they reveal who we really are. He saw the flicker of something, worry maybe, or fear, in Madison's eyes, and he held her gaze as he said softly, "It's easy to believe you're untouchable when no one has ever held you accountable. But today, we're going to see what happens when the truth is given the space to speak." He moved with quiet purpose to his desk, opening the worn leather briefcase that had always been more than just a place to store papers. It was a symbol of everything he had fought to protect, everything he refused to let them take from him. Inside, the folder David Lee had given him lay nestled like a secret weapon, each page a testament to the reality Madison and Jessica had tried so hard to deny. He could feel the weight of every word, every image, every message that had been shared in whispered conversations and private group chats that were never meant to see the light of day. And as he lifted the folder from the case, he felt a quiet surge of resolve that left no room for doubt or fear. He turned to face the class, and in that moment, Marcus felt the truth settle into his bones. A calm, implacable force that told him this was no longer just about him or even about them. This was about the promise he had made to himself and to every student who had ever felt the sting of prejudice or the weight of silence. And he would not break that promise. Marcus entered the classroom the next morning with a quiet, resolute calm that seemed to radiate from him like a subtle force field, the kind of calm that made even the most confident voices falter and left no room for anything but the truth. The girls were already there when he arrived, Madison and Jessica sitting side by side at the front of the room, their posture straight and stiff, as if they were bracing for a storm they couldn't stop. Madison's hair fell in perfect waves around her face, her phone resting on the desk like a shield she refused to put down. But her eyes flickered up at Marcus as he crossed the room. Just a flicker, gone in an instant, but enough for him to see the uncertainty she was working so hard to hide. Jessica's pen tapped out a restless rhythm against the edge of her notebook. The quiet, staccato beat the only sound in a room that had grown too still, and Marcus could feel the way the silence pressed in from every corner, thick with the weight of things left unsaid. He set his briefcase down on the desk, the soft thump of worn leather against wood somehow louder than the laughter that had once filled this space, and he took a moment to look around the room, his gaze moving from face to face, seeing the wary curiosity in the eyes of those who had once been content to stay silent, and the subtle defiance in the shoulders of those who still believed they could outlast him. Madison shifted in her seat, her phone clutched just a little tighter, and Marcus let his gaze rest on her for a moment longer. Not in challenge, but in the calm, steady way that told her he saw past the smirk and the quick comebacks to the fragile truth she was fighting to keep buried. "Today," he said quietly, his voice smooth and unhurried, "we're going to talk about consequences." He saw the way Madison's mouth twitched, the way Jessica's pen stilled in her hand, and he knew they understood exactly what he meant, even if they weren't ready to admit it yet. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The authority in his tone came not from volume, but from the quiet, unwavering conviction that carried each word like a promise. "Consequences," he continued, "are not punishments. They are simply the inevitable results of the choices we make. The truths we try to hide have a way of finding their way to the surface." He moved to the board then, writing the word in large, careful letters. Consequences. He underlined it once, a single deliberate stroke of blue marker that seemed to echo in the hush of the room. When he turned back to face them, his eyes settled on Madison, and in that brief, unbroken gaze, he let her see the calm certainty in him, the promise that no matter how hard she fought to twist the narrative, he would not let her rewrite the truth. Madison swallowed hard, her jaw tightening, and Jessica shot her a glance that was equal parts questioning and uncertain, as if she was no longer sure she wanted to be part of this game. Marcus saw it all, the shifting alliances and the first hairline fractures in the perfect facade they had so carefully constructed, and he felt the quiet surge of resolve that had carried him through every battle he had ever fought. He turned back to the desk then, his hand resting lightly on the worn leather of the briefcase, and as he unlatched the brass clasp, the sound of it opening was like the soft click of a lock giving way, small but final. Inside, the folder David Lee had given him lay waiting, each page a testament to the small, casual cruelties that had been whispered in dark corners and typed out in the secret spaces of private chats. Madison's fingers twitched around her phone, her breathing just a little too quick, and Jessica's pen fell silent on her desk, the room holding its breath as Marcus lifted the folder from the case. He didn't rush. He let the weight of the moment settle into every corner of the room, the quiet authority of his movements speaking louder than any words. When he finally looked up, the calm in his gaze was like a lighthouse in the storm, unmoving, unwavering, and inescapable. "Sometimes," he said softly, his voice carrying in the absolute silence, "the only way to move forward is to let the truth speak for itself." And as he spoke, he knew that the moment he had been waiting for was close now, close enough that he could almost taste the sharp edge of it in the air, and he was ready, not just to defend himself, but to show them all that the quiet power of the truth was stronger than any lie they could ever tell. Marcus stood there with the folder in his hands, feeling the quiet weight of it as both burden and liberation, and for a single moment he let the room breathe around him, the way the air seemed to shift and tremble with every unspoken question and every unacknowledged fear that had been building in these walls for far too long. Madison's eyes darted to the folder and back to his face, a flicker of panic behind the practiced calm she wore like armor, and Jessica sat frozen beside her, her lips slightly parted as if she had something to say, but no words to give it shape. The rest of the class had gone utterly still, every rustle of paper and every half-formed whisper swallowed up by the quiet intensity that radiated from the front of the room, and Marcus took one slow breath before he began. He laid the folder down on the desk with deliberate care, each movement measured and unhurried, and then he opened it, revealing the first page, a screenshot of a private group chat. The name of the group written in bold letters across the top, Disaster Diversity. He held it up for the class to see, his expression calm but unyielding, and said softly, "This is what some of you have chosen to create, a space to mock, to belittle, to tear down, not because you're right, but because you thought no one would ever see." Madison's breath caught in her throat, her hands tightening around her phone, and Jessica let out a quiet gasp that she tried to swallow back as if it might make it disappear. Marcus didn't look away. He turned the page to the next screenshot. Messages from Madison and Jessica, laughing about the diversity hire who didn't belong, their words cruel and casual in a way that left no doubt about their intent. He spoke softly, but each word landed like a stone in the silence. "You thought this was just a game," he said, his voice never rising above that calm certainty. "But the stories we tell about other people have power, and so do the stories we tell about ourselves." The air in the room seemed to crackle with the weight of it, every student leaning forward in their seats as if caught between disbelief and the slow, dawning understanding that this was no longer just a class. It was a reckoning. Madison opened her mouth as if to protest, but no sound came out, and Marcus turned another page, revealing images of Madison's posts mocking classmates on financial aid, Jessica's comments about how some voices didn't deserve to be heard, each one a fragment of the story they had tried to keep hidden. "I have spent my life learning to listen to the quiet places where the truth lives," Marcus said, his voice low but carrying in the hush, "and I will not stand by while those truths are twisted into weapons." He let the silence settle again, heavy and absolute, and then he looked at Madison and Jessica, not with anger, but with the quiet, implacable conviction of a man who had decided long ago that he would never again let others define his worth. "Today," he said, "we begin to hold each other accountable for the stories we choose to tell, and for the harm those stories can cause." And as he spoke those words, the room seemed to shift around him, the weight of all their whispered cruelties laid bare in the bright light of a truth that refused to be denied. Marcus let the last words hang in the air, heavy as stone, and for a long, breathless moment, no one moved, no one spoke. Madison's shoulders were drawn tight, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge of her phone, as if it were a lifeline she couldn't let go of. Jessica sat rigid beside her, her eyes wide and unblinking, the mask of practiced calm slipping just enough to reveal the fear that had taken root beneath. Across the room, the other students looked on in stunned, almost reverent silence, the usual undercurrent of restless energy replaced by something more solemn, more raw. Marcus closed the folder with a soft, final click that seemed to echo in the hush, his hand steady even as he felt the quiet storm of adrenaline and purpose churning in his chest. He looked around the room, meeting each gaze with that same unwavering calm, and saw in their eyes the first flickering embers of understanding, small and fragile, but enough to tell him that the truth had taken root here, that the lies Madison and Jessica had built their power on were crumbling in the bright, unflinching light of exposure. "You don't have to say anything," he said softly, his voice low and steady as he met Madison's gaze again, "because I think we all know the difference between words spoken in the dark and the silence that comes when the truth is finally given room to breathe." Madison looked away then, her jaw tight, and Marcus saw it, the smallest crack in her composure, the brief, unguarded moment when her shoulders slumped as if under a weight she had never thought she'd have to carry. Jessica let out a soft, shaky breath, her fingers tangled in the pages of her notebook, as if she were trying to find an anchor in the words she had once used as weapons. Around them, the room was so still it felt almost sacred, a fragile moment of reckoning that Marcus knew would be gone in an instant if he didn't give it the space to settle, to take hold. He took a step back, his hands resting lightly on the worn surface of his desk, and let the silence stretch just a little longer, letting it do what all the lectures and arguments in the world never could. Let them feel the weight of what they had done. Let them see the truth of it in the quiet they could no longer fill with laughter or smirks or the easy dismissal of privilege. And as he stood there, watching the slow, careful shift in their eyes, he knew that this was the beginning of something more than just an apology or an admission of guilt. It was the first trembling step towards something they had never imagined they'd have to face. The knowledge that the power they had taken for granted was no longer theirs to wield without consequence. Dot. The bell rang, but no one moved, the usual flurry of backpacks and laughter replaced by a stillness that seemed to stretch long past the edges of the room. Madison's eyes were fixed on the floor, her fingers wrapped tight around her phone, as if the smooth glass might somehow erase the words she'd written. Jessica swallowed hard, her face pale, her notebook lying forgotten in front of her. Around them, the other students shifted in their seats, their faces a careful mask of shock and something else, something closer to respect than any of them had ever shown before. Marcus let the silence linger for a moment longer, letting it settle into the corners of the room like a quiet promise, and then he spoke, his voice calm, the weight of each word grounding them in a truth that could no longer be denied. "This doesn't end here," he said softly, "because the harm we do in secret doesn't vanish just because it's been exposed. It echoes in the lives of those we've hurt, in the quiet spaces we carry with us long after the laughter fades." Madison flinched just slightly, her shoulders hunching in on themselves, in a way that told Marcus she was finally feeling the weight of what she'd done, the weight of every whispered word and every cruel laugh that had seemed so harmless until the light found them. Jessica's eyes flickered up to meet his, the defiance that had once burned so bright in them, now replaced by something like regret. And in that fleeting moment, Marcus saw the possibility of change, the first fragile flicker of understanding that might yet grow into something more. He closed the folder and set it down on the desk, his fingers brushing lightly over the worn leather as if to anchor himself in the calm he had fought so hard to find. "I'm not here to destroy anyone," he said quietly, his gaze sweeping the room, meeting each student's eyes with a calm, steady certainty that left no room for doubt. "I'm here to show you that the stories we tell, the ones we whisper in the dark, and the ones we pretend don't matter, shape us in ways we can't always see. And sometimes, the only way to move forward is to let the truth speak, no matter how uncomfortable it feels." The room was so quiet that the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed almost deafening, and Marcus let that quiet fill the space between them, knowing that in that silence lay the seeds of something deeper than any punishment or reprimand ever could. A reckoning that went beyond consequences and reached for something more lasting, the chance to choose a different story. Marcus let the bell's shrill ring fade into the heavy silence that followed, each second of that quiet a thread winding tighter around the room until it felt like even the air was holding its breath. He didn't rush to speak. He let the stillness settle, let it wrap around the edges of every desk and every restless glance until the students began to squirm beneath its weight, because he knew that sometimes the most powerful words were the ones that rose from the spaces we so often tried to fill with noise. Madison's shoulders were drawn tight, her chin tucked low, as if she thought she could hide behind the gleam of her phone. But Marcus saw the way her hands trembled against the glass, the small, involuntary tremor of someone who had never imagined the world might see her so clearly. Jessica stared at the folder Marcus had closed and set down, her fingers twisted in the fabric of her skirt, her breath quick and shallow, like she was still trying to convince herself that if she could just find the right words, she might still be able to rewrite the ending of this story. Around them, the rest of the class shifted in their seats, some of them glancing at each other with wide eyes, others watching Marcus with a new kind of quiet intensity that said they understood, finally understood, that what they were witnessing was more than a lesson, more than a moment of discipline or shame. It was a turning point. Marcus let his gaze sweep the room, seeing each of them not as the roles they had played, class clown, golden child, quiet observer, but as something more raw, more real. He saw the girl in the back row, who had always watched with wary eyes, now leaning forward, her lips parted as if she was holding her breath. He saw the boy, who had always laughed the loudest, now biting his lip, his fingers drumming nervously against the desk. And he felt it. A flicker of something that wasn't triumph or vindication, but the quiet, resolute hope that maybe, just maybe, this would be the moment they learned to see each other, and themselves, differently. He turned back to Madison and Jessica, his voice soft but unyielding. "I'm not here to destroy you," he said, the quiet conviction in his words weaving through the room like a lifeline. "I'm here to show you what happens when we stop pretending the things we do in the dark don't matter. When we stop pretending that words said in whispers can't still leave scars." Madison's breath hitched, her mouth opening like she wanted to argue, but no sound came out. Jessica blinked rapidly, her eyes shining with the first glimmering edge of tears she was trying so hard to swallow back. And in that flicker of vulnerability, Marcus saw not weakness, but the first painful step towards something better. The rest of the class sat frozen, the usual rustle of backpacks and quiet chatter at the end of the period gone, replaced by a silence that felt almost sacred. And in that quiet, Marcus let himself breathe. Let himself feel the weight of every battle he had fought to get to this moment, the exhaustion and the steady, unwavering strength that had carried him here. He closed his eyes for a heartbeat, hearing his grandmother's voice in the back of his mind. "The world will always try to tell you who you are. Don't let it. Show them instead." And when he opened his eyes again, he felt the calm settle over him like armor, the certainty that no matter what came next, he would not be moved. "I don't expect you to have the answers today," he said finally, his voice low, but carrying to every corner of the room. "But I expect you to start asking the questions about the choices you make, about the harm they cause, about the kind of people you want to be when the easy laughter fades and you're left with nothing but the truth." The bell rang again, a shrill final note that seemed to crack the moment open, and still no one moved, because they all knew, in the quiet that followed, that something had shifted. Something had begun to unravel, and there was no going back. As the students slowly filed out of the room, the usual clamor of laughter and chatter was replaced by a heavy quiet, each footstep echoing in the stillness like a question that had no easy answer. Madison moved stiffly, her phone clutched against her chest like a fragile shield, her eyes focused on the floor as if afraid to meet the gaze of anyone who might see her too clearly now. Jessica followed close behind, her lips pressed tight together, the lines of her face etched with something that looked a lot like regret, but hadn't yet found the courage to speak its name. Marcus watched them go, his expression calm, but inside he felt the weight of it all settle into his chest. The weight of every word spoken and every truth laid bare, the weight of knowing that change, real change, was never as simple as a single moment of reckoning. It was a slow, sometimes painful unraveling, a process that required each of them to decide who they would be in the silence that came after the confrontation. He gathered the folder in his briefcase, the leather worn soft and smooth beneath his fingers, and as he stepped into the hallway, he could feel the shift ripple outward. Small glances exchanged in the corners of the hallway, the way conversations hushed when he passed, not in fear, but in a kind of quiet, watchful respect that had never been there before. David Lee was waiting by the water fountain, his expression thoughtful, and as Marcus approached, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "You did it," he said quietly. "You showed them what it means to be seen, and what it means to refuse to let anyone else write your story for you." Marcus nodded, feeling the truth of that settle into his bones. "It's not over," he said softly, "but it's a start." David smiled, a flicker of pride in his eyes. "It's more than that, Marcus. It's the beginning of something they'll carry with them long after they leave this place." Marcus let out a slow breath, feeling the exhaustion of the past few weeks begin to give way to something lighter, something that felt like hope. Because he knew that for every Madison and Jessica, there were a dozen others who had been watching, listening, learning. And for every word that had been used to tear him down, there were now seeds of understanding taking root in the silence. He walked away from the water fountain with a quiet certainty in his step, his mind already turning to the next lesson, the next conversation, the next chance to show his students that the stories they told, about themselves, about each other, had the power to shape the world around them. And he knew, with a calm certainty that filled his chest like a steady flame, that he would be ready to meet them there, again and again, as long as it took. Marcus felt the day unfold around him like the quiet aftermath of a storm. Each hallway he walked down filled with small, uncertain glances and conversations that fell silent as he passed. Where once there had been careless laughter and whispered mockery, now there was a hush that spoke of questions being asked, of minds turning over the weight of the words he had spoken, and the truths he had laid bare. In the teacher's lounge, he felt the shift there too. The usual low murmur of coffee spoons and half-distracted greetings paused when he entered, and he saw in the eyes of his colleagues the careful respect of those who had seen a line crossed and a stand taken, and who understood, some for the first time, what it meant to bear witness to that. David Lee gave him a nod across the room, a small, quiet acknowledgement that said more than any speech. And in that nod, Marcus felt the reassurance that he was not alone in this fight, that the small alliances forged in quiet conversations and shared glances were as powerful as any declaration made in the open. Madison and Jessica kept their distance in the days that followed, their usual laughter and bright, biting words replaced by a brittle silence that said they were learning the cost of every careless word they had once let slip so easily. Marcus watched them with the same calm patience that had guided him through every lesson, knowing that change, real change, was not a punishment or a performance, but a choice each of them would have to make for themselves. And around them, the rest of the class began to lean into that silence, to fill it with questions instead of jokes, with small, tentative acts of kindness that had once seemed out of place in a room that had known only competition and cruelty. Elena Rodriguez stayed after class to ask for a reading list, her voice trembling but her eyes bright with curiosity. David Kim volunteered to lead a discussion on the book they'd been studying, his voice quiet but firm in a way that made Marcus smile. Even the walls of room 301 seemed to breathe a little easier now, the weight of the lies that had once pressed so heavy against them lifting in the slow, steady work of listening and learning. And Marcus felt it too, in the way his shoulders no longer carried the same weight of expectation, in the way he could stand at the front of that room and know that the truth, uncomfortable, undeniable, had found a place here. Marcus felt the day unfold around him like the quiet aftermath of a storm. Each hallway he walked down filled with small, uncertain glances and conversations that fell silent as he passed, the air itself carrying the weight of everything that had been revealed and everything that still lingered in the unspoken spaces between the students. Where once there had been careless laughter and whispered mockery, now there was a hush that spoke not just of fear, but of something deeper, a dawning awareness that the walls they had built around themselves were not as impenetrable as they had once believed. In the teacher's lounge, the atmosphere shifted in subtle ways. The usual low murmur of coffee spoons against ceramic and half-distracted greetings paused when Marcus entered, and he saw in the eyes of his colleagues a careful, thoughtful respect that had never been there before, a recognition that what had happened in room 301 was more than just a confrontation. It was a line drawn in the sand, a quiet declaration that the old ways of looking the other way would no longer be enough. David Lee met his eyes across the room, giving a small, almost imperceptible nod that spoke of solidarity, of shared understanding between those who had spent too long learning to carry their dignity like a shield. Madison and Jessica kept their distance in the days that followed, their usual laughter and bright, biting words replaced by a brittle silence that clung to them like a shadow. Marcus watched them without judgment, his expression calm, but inside, he felt the quiet ache of knowing that even the most fragile beginnings of change were born in those uncomfortable silences. Madison's shoulders were hunched a little lower now, her gaze no longer meeting his with the easy defiance it once had, and Jessica's eyes were shadowed with something that looked a lot like regret, though she never let it settle long enough to take shape. Around them, the rest of the class began to lean into that silence, to fill it not with laughter or easy excuses, but with questions. Soft, halting questions that spoke of minds turning over the weight of what they had seen. Elena Rodriguez lingered after class one afternoon, her voice trembling as she asked for a reading list on voices like hers, voices that had too long been kept in the margins. David Kim, who had once shrunk beneath the weight of other people's laughter, volunteered to lead a discussion on the book they had been reading, his voice quiet but filled with a steadiness that made Marcus smile. Even the walls of room 301 seemed to breathe a little easier now, the weight of the lies and laughter that had once pressed so heavy against them, lifting in the slow, patient work of listening and learning. Marcus felt it in his own bones, too, in the way his shoulders no longer carried the same constant tension, in the way he could stand at the front of the room and know that the truth, uncomfortable, undeniable, had finally found a place here. One afternoon, as he packed up his briefcase at the end of the day, he paused to look around the room, the scuffed desks, the faded posters, the faint scratches on the whiteboard that had always been there, but somehow felt different now. He let his gaze linger on each detail, the small, familiar things that had once felt like a battleground and now felt like the quiet promise of something new. And in that moment, he felt a calm certainty settle into his chest. That change was never about a single moment of reckoning or a single voice raised in defiance. It was about the small, patient work of seeing and being seen, of refusing to let the easy silences drown out the hard truths. As he turned off the lights and stepped into the dim glow of the hallway, Marcus carried that promise with him, each step a quiet testament to the power of stories, and the courage it took to tell them honestly. The final days of the semester felt like the quiet unfolding of a story Marcus had waited his whole life to tell. The classroom no longer crackled with the brittle laughter of those who thought they owned every conversation. It hummed with something softer, something alive with the possibility of change. Madison and Jessica sat in their usual seats, but their eyes no longer held the same easy defiance. Instead, there was a watchfulness there, a guarded willingness to listen that had once seemed impossible. The rest of the class followed suit. Where there had once been whispered barbs and careless jokes, now there were careful questions. Thoughtful pauses, the slow, sometimes awkward work of learning how to speak without wounding. Marcus saw it in the way David Kim's voice grew stronger each time he shared his thoughts, in the way Elena Rodriguez no longer hesitated before raising her hand. Even the smallest gestures, a shared glance, a quiet word of encouragement, felt like small seeds of something larger taking root. Marcus guided them through the final lessons of the year with the same quiet, unshakable calm he had carried from the very first day. He spoke of the power of narrative, of how the stories we choose to tell, about ourselves, about each other, could either heal or harm, and he saw in the students' eyes the slow dawning understanding that this wasn't just about books or essays or grades. It was about how they carried themselves in the world beyond these four walls. On the last day of class, he stood in front of them one final time, the weight of everything they had shared hanging in the stillness. "This room has always been more than just a classroom," he said softly. "It's a space where we learn not just what's in the books, but what's in ourselves, where we learn to see each other as whole people, with all the messy, beautiful complexity that comes with that." Madison looked up at him then, her eyes meeting his with a quiet, almost fragile honesty. "Thank you," she said simply. And in that small, unadorned phrase, Marcus heard the echo of everything they had worked to build together. As the students filed out, some pausing to offer shy smiles or quiet nods, Marcus felt the exhaustion of the past months settle into something gentler, a sense of peace that came not from victory, but from knowing he had given them the tools to choose their own stories from here on out. He lingered for a moment in the empty classroom, the late afternoon light painting the desks in soft gold, and allowed himself a small, tired smile, because he knew this was only the beginning, and whatever came next, whatever challenges, whatever quiet revolutions still waited in the shadows, he would be ready to meet them. The final days of the semester felt like a soft, deliberate exhale, the quiet aftermath of storms that had once howled so fiercely in the corners of room 301. Each morning, Marcus stepped through the doorway with a calm steadiness that spoke of battles fought and truths laid bare, and he found that the air itself seemed to carry the faint, hopeful hum of something fragile and new. Madison and Jessica still sat at the front of the room, but the rigid defiance in their shoulders had begun to soften, replaced by a careful stillness that Marcus recognized as the first, halting steps of reckoning. Madison's gaze, once sharp with practiced superiority, had grown thoughtful, her phone now face down on the desk, as if even she understood that some silences were worth more than 1,000 biting words. Jessica still fidgeted with the corners of her notebook, but her eyes met his without the flicker of challenge that had once sparked there, only a quiet, questioning curiosity that told him she was finally learning to listen. The rest of the class moved through the days with a kind of hushed reverence, their laughter softer, their conversation slower, as if they understood, truly understood, that every word spoken here mattered. Marcus saw it in the small, careful gestures that might have gone unnoticed in the noise of the weeks before. The way David Kim offered a seat to Elena Rodriguez. The way the girl in the back row, who had once watched everything with wary eyes, now leaned forward, her pencil poised as if ready to write her own story. He carried them through the final lessons with a quiet, deliberate patience, weaving threads of literature and lived experience into something that felt less like a syllabus and more like a promise. He spoke of the power of stories, not just the ones in the pages of old books, but the ones they carried in their hearts, the ones they whispered to themselves in the dark. And he saw in their eyes the slow dawning realization that these stories had weight, that they shaped not only how they saw the world, but how they chose to move through it. On the last day, Marcus stood at the front of the room with the soft afternoon light painting long, golden stripes across the desks, and he let his gaze sweep over each face, seeing not just the students they had been, but the people they were becoming. "This room," he said softly, his voice steady and sure, "has always been more than just a place to learn facts and figures. It's a place where we learn how to see each other, how to hold space for each other's stories, even when those stories are hard to hear." Madison's head lifted, her eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity that held no defiance, only the flickering edge of something like understanding. Jessica swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around her pen, and for the first time, she didn't look away. Marcus let the silence stretch, holding them there in that delicate, unspoken moment where the past and the future met and settled into something solid and real. Then, with a small, tired smile, he closed his book and said, "Class dismissed." They rose slowly, some pausing to offer shy smiles or quiet thanks, others slipping out with heads bowed in thought. Madison lingered for a moment by the door, her phone still face down in her hand, and when she met his gaze, she whispered, "Thank you." 2 words, but they carried the weight of everything they had refused to say before. Jessica followed close behind, her shoulders squared, as if she were bracing for something she couldn't yet name, but she paused too, her lips parting in the beginning of an apology that didn't quite come. Marcus met her eyes and nodded once, a silent answer to the question she didn't need to speak. When the last of them had gone, Marcus stood in the empty classroom, the golden light turning the worn desks into something almost beautiful, and he let himself breathe. He felt the exhaustion of the past week settle into something gentler, an ache that was no longer just the weight of what he had fought to protect, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the fight had not been in vain. Because he knew this was only the beginning. The work was not done, it never would be, but he saw now that it didn't have to be. It was enough to know that the stories he had shared, the truths he had refused to let be buried, had found a place to grow in the minds of those who had once thought themselves above them. And as he closed the door behind him, the echo of the latch, a soft punctuation mark in the quiet of the hallway, Marcus carried with him the quiet, resolute knowledge that whatever came next, he would be ready to meet it with the same calm certainty, the same unwavering belief that had brought him here. And so, as the echoes of his quiet defiance settled into the dusty corners of room 301, and the final rays of sunlight spilled across the worn desks, Marcus Thompson walked away, not with the thunder of triumph, but with the steady certainty of a man who had refused to let anyone else write his story. In that silence, in the space he carved out with nothing but calm conviction and the truth he would not let them bury, lay the promise of something more. A classroom where every voice mattered, a world where the laughter of the privileged could no longer drown out the quiet power of those who had always been told to stay silent. It was not the end, because for Marcus and the students who had learned to see themselves and each other more clearly, the real work was only just beginning. And in that beginning, in every small, defiant act of listening and seeing and refusing to be diminished, lay the quiet, unwavering hope that the world could be remade. One story, one lesson, one voice at a time.